Curtis Rafford's world was shattered by a single phone call. A brief, calm voice on the other end spoke with the practiced tone of authority, claiming to be from the Department of Veterans Affairs. Curtis, a 92-year-old Navy veteran who had served 30 years defending his country, listened carefully. They said there was a problem with his benefits check, that his account had been flagged for irregular activity, and that they needed to verify his identity immediately. Trusting what he thought was an official voice, Curtis complied. The cost of that trust was devastating. Within minutes, his bank account was emptied. Every cent gone along with the quiet peace he had fought to keep in his later years. That morning, the automatic doors of Georgia First Bank hissed open as Curtis entered. The chill of early autumn crept in, but his faded navy coat, worn thin at the elbows, barely kept the cold at bay. His slow, deliberate steps echoed decades of experience. Miles marched in faraway lands, battles survived, and comrades lost. The worn Navy cap perched low on his head bore the faded gold stitching, USS Belleau Wood, 1952. Curtis was a man who carried history on his shoulders, yet in the crowded bank lobby, he was invisible. People around him were preoccupied, their eyes glued to glowing screens. No one offered a seat or even a glance. The woman in front of him, dressed in crisp business attire, sighed loudly, muttering, "Why do they even come alone?" They slow up the line. Curtis said nothing, only folded the letter from the VA, a delayed payment notice, neatly into his pocket. When his turn arrived, the young clerk barely looked up as he explained the missing deposit. Her dismissive tone and gum popping punctuated the message. If it's not in the system, it's not here. Nearby, a security guard chuckled softly. Probably just confused. "Poor guy thinks he's still back in the Navy," he muttered. Curtis didn't react. Instead, he nodded once and stepped aside, his eyes briefly catching the American flag near the door. With a silent, reverent salute, he honored the symbol that had accompanied him through war and peace. Back in his modest apartment, the cold draft slipped through peeling paint and rattled the ancient refrigerator. Curtis sat at his kitchen table, a chipped mug of black coffee warming his hands. The VA letter lay beside a yellowed notepad filled with tight scribbles, budget notes, rent-due medication reminders. The missing stipend wasn't much in dollars, but to Curtis, it was everything: a space heater to chase away the cold food on his shelf, perhaps new soles for his worn boots. Then the phone rang. The voice on the other end was smooth, calm, professional, a young man named Devin Clark from Veteran Security Affairs. He explained the issue with Curtis's benefits and offered to help verify his identity. Curtis hesitated, memories flashing of cold, muddy trenches and the perils of misplaced trust. Yet the tone was so official, so respectful. When the 6-digit verification code flashed on Curtis's flip phone, he read it aloud as instructed. "Perfect. You're all set, sir. You should see your funds shortly. Thank you for your service." But when Curtis checked his bank account moments later, the numbers struck like a bullet to the chest: $0. All gone. His hands trembled, not from age, but from the cold sting of betrayal. The man who had faced enemy fire, pulled comrades from burning wreckage, and stood steady with a rusted M16, now felt powerless against a faceless thief, wielding only a phone line. That night, Curtis sat alone by the window in his worn armchair, the glow of the street lamp casting long shadows. No distant gunfire, no alarms, only a silence heavier than any battlefield. The VA letter crumpled at his feet was a cruel reminder of a war he hadn't chosen, but was now fighting again, a fight for his dignity. As the first cold light of dawn filtered through the blinds, Curtis rose slowly, joints aching but spirit unbroken. He poured a cup of lukewarm coffee and prepared to face the day, knowing that this was just the beginning of a journey no veteran should have to walk alone. Curtis Rafford had faced countless challenges in his 92 years, but none quite like the invisible weight pressing down on him now. After the cruel phone call that emptied his bank account, he found himself not only stripped of his savings, but also brushed aside by the very institutions meant to protect him. The cold indifference of the busy bank and the dismissive sneers from strangers in the lobby felt like another kind of battle won, where he was alone on the front lines. In the crowded Georgia First Bank, Curtis stood patiently in line, his hands tucked into fingerless gloves, his old Navy coat hanging loosely on his thin frame. The hum of conversations, the clicking of keyboards, and the tapping of phones filled the air, but no one noticed the proud shoulders beneath that worn fabric. His cap, embroidered with the faded words, USS Belleau Wood, was a quiet badge of honor that went unseen. The impatient sighs of others, especially the woman muttering about why they even came alone, cut through the air like a whispered rejection. When it was his turn to speak, Curtis approached the teller with his neatly folded VA letter in hand. "I'm here about a direct deposit error," he said softly. The young clerk barely looked up, chewing gum with a distracted air. "Nothing's posted yet. Maybe check back next week, sir." The dismissiveness stung, but Curtis held his ground. "They said it would be today," he replied, voice steady yet tinged with quiet frustration. The clerk's cold reply, "Doesn't matter what the paper says. If it's not in the system, it's not here," was a final dismissal. As Curtis stepped away, a security guard chuckled nearby, muttering something about the old man being confused and stuck in the past. Curtis didn't respond. Instead, his gaze drifted to the American flag by the door. With two fingers gently touching his brow, he gave a silent, forgotten salute, a private ritual honoring the nation he had served for 3 decades. Later at the local police precinct, Curtis's attempts to report the scam were met with skepticism and scorn. The waiting room smelled of stale coffee and paper-cold plastic benches pressing against tired bodies. Curtis sat patiently clutching his numbered ticket, watching as numbers ticked past his. When his number was finally called, he faced a young officer whose dismissive smirk spoke volumes before a word was uttered. "Name," the officer asked without looking up. "Curtis Rafford." "I want to report a theft, a scam. They cleaned out my account." The officer tapped keys lazily. "Scam, huh? Let me guess you gave some Nigerian prince your info?" Curtis said nothing, the accusation hanging heavy in the air. "I got a call," Curtis said evenly. "They sounded official. Mentioned my exact VA stipend amount." The officer laughed loudly, eyes rolling. "Man, you old folks fall for this every week. Don't give out codes over the phone. That's rule number 1. Curtis's jaw tightened. "I came here to report a crime. This isn't a mistake, it's your failure." The officer shrugged. "We're not a bank recovery service. You need to call your credit union." A heavy silence fell between them. Curtis stood straighter, the years of service flooding back in a heartbeat. "I served 30 years in the Navy. I buried friends younger than you who died protecting the right for people like you to wear that badge." The officer scoffed. "Thanks for your service, but we have real cases." As Curtis turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of a plainclothes officer passing behind the desk who paused briefly, watching the exchange with concern. The door shut behind Curtis, but his voice carried firmly. "The world doesn't owe me anything, but you owe this badge respect." Outside, the cold bit into Curtis's face as he walked the 5 blocks home, each step slower than the last. He was invisible to the young couples laughing over coffee, the teenagers on bikes and the joggers, too absorbed in their music to notice the old man, who once faced danger without fear. At his apartment, Maya, the janitor from the bank, was sweeping the steps. She looked up, worry creasing her brow. "Mr. Rafford, you okay? You look different." Curtis hesitated. "Had to file a police report. Someone stole my benefits." "Did they help you?" she asked softly. He said nothing. Maya's eyes softened. "Mind if I take your picture? People should hear this." Curtis, who shunned attention, nodded quietly. Holding the worn VA letter, he stood silhouetted under the gray sky as Maya snapped the photo. That night, Maya's post went live. "This is Mr. Curtis Rafford, Navy veteran scammed and dismissed. We must do better." And as the city slept, a quiet storm began to gather. Curtis Rafford's story was no longer just his own. After Maya's photo went online, a quiet ripple of awareness began to swell into a wave. The image of the old Navy veteran standing stoic beneath a gray sky, clutching the crumpled VA letter, struck a chord far beyond the small neighborhood he called home. Within hours, the post had spread like wildfire, sparking conversations in living rooms, on social media feeds, and in veteran halls across the state. Maya watched the numbers climb her phone, buzzing relentlessly with notifications. Comments poured in expressions of shock, anger, and most of all, respect. Among the flood of messages were voices from people who remembered Curtis not as a forgotten old man, but as a legend. Former sailors who served under him, soldiers saved by his steady hand, and friends who recalled the countless times he put others before himself. One message caught Maya's attention: Curtis Rafford, as in Commander Rafford. I served under him aboard the USS Belleau Wood. Man's a legend. Others followed swiftly, sharing stories that seemed like fragments of a forgotten history. He pulled my brother out of a downed helicopter in '66, led the extraction unit during the fall of Saigon, took shrapnel to the chest, refused evacuation so his team could get out first. By midday, the story had caught the eye of a local journalist. A news crew arrived at Curtis's apartment building, cameras rolling and microphones poised, but inside, Curtis remained unaware. He sat quietly in his worn chair, the glow from the television flickering on his face, oblivious to the digital storm that had erupted around him. The internet had remembered Curtis before he remembered himself. Decades of solitude and fading memories gave way to a swelling chorus of voices that refused to let his sacrifices be ignored. Support groups tagged him. Veteran organizations shared the post. Influential figures weighed in amplifying the call for recognition and justice. Maya sat back, a quiet smile touching her lips. She hadn't expected the post to go viral, certainly not overnight. But the power of truth and community was undeniable. The image of one man, resilient and dignified, had sparked a movement to reclaim respect for all veterans, too often forgotten. And far beyond the glowing screens and busy feeds, Curtis's name began to echo once more. The story of Curtis Rafford had ignited a fire far beyond the borders of his neighborhood. By dawn, news outlets had caught wind of the viral post, and within hours, television screens across Georgia, and soon the entire nation were filled with images of the elderly Navy veteran who had been scammed and dismissed. Social media exploded with hashtags like Yuri You Honor Curtis and Asham Veterans Deserve Better, flooding timelines with messages of outrage and solidarity. At the White House, the urgency was palpable. An assistant to the chief of staff opened an email with the subject line, "Urgent national outcry over veterans' mistreatment, Curtis Rafford." Coffee nearly spilled as the email was passed up the chain. By mid-morning, the press secretary was briefed. By noon, the story had reached the president himself. Photographs of Curtis, stoic and dignified under rain-soaked skies, holding his crumpled VA letter, were plastered across headlines nationwide. But it wasn't just the image that struck a nerve. The comments poured in from decorated generals, former senators, journalists, and thousands of everyday Americans, each echoing the same truth. Curtis Rafford was not just a victim, he was a symbol. A man who had saved lives in far-flung wars, who had been mocked in a police precinct for his age and service, and who now stood as a stark reminder of a system that had failed its own. The president leaned back in his chair, reading the reports aloud to his national security advisor. Commander Rafford saved 2 pilots during Operation Rolling Thunder. First Black commander of the 3rd Naval Rescue Fleet. Never sought promotion over others, always chose integrity. The room fell silent for a moment before the president spoke again, voice low but resolute. He was mocked for being old. This cannot stand. An immediate directive followed: locate Curtis Rafford, arrange a personal apology, launch a full-scale review of every VA scam complaint in the last year. If Curtis slipped through the cracks, others surely had as well. Back in Atlanta, news vans lined the curb outside Curtis's apartment. Crowds gathered, veterans, community members, local officials, all united in support. Young ROC cadets stood at attention, refusing to leave until they had the chance to meet the man who had quietly become a national hero. Inside, Curtis sat in his armchair, the glow of the television casting flickering shadows. The room was filled with voices from the news, but his mind was elsewhere, far from the digital storm swirling around him. Then the phone rang. He answered slowly. "Mr. Rafford, this is Denise Fowler, Deputy Director of Veterans Affairs," came the gentle voice on the line. "I'm calling at the request of the President. We are deeply sorry for what happened to you. You have not been forgotten. A multi-agency investigation is underway into the scam you reported and the precinct that failed you." Curtis remained silent for a moment, the weight of the words sinking in. Then, with the calm that had carried him through storms far deadlier, he said, "I didn't ask for any of this. I just wanted to be heard." And now Fowler replied softly, "The whole nation is listening." Outside, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up quietly. Inside sat a man in uniform, his chest decorated with stars and medals, a man who had once been a young recruit under Curtis Rafford's command. He stepped out into the chill evening, eyes steady and resolute. As dusk settled, the precinct that had dismissed Curtis found itself under a national spotlight. Officers stood rigid tension, thick in the air. The Atlanta police chief pulled from a budget meeting paced anxiously as headlines scrolled across the muted television in the conference room. Behind the public drama, federal agencies FBI, DOJ, and the VA were coordinating a joint investigation into a veteran scam ring. The quiet strength of one man had become a catalyst for a reckoning that could no longer be ignored. Behind the rising tide of public outrage and national attention, a darker truth began to unravel, one that struck at the very heart of the system Curtis Rafford had trusted. As the joint investigation by the FBI Department of Justice and Veterans Affairs deepened, a troubling pattern emerged. The phone number used in the scam that had emptied Curtis's account was traced not to some faceless criminal overseas, but to a burner phone connected to someone far closer, someone within the Atlanta police precinct itself. The name that surfaced sent a chill through the investigator's officer Jason Myers, the very same officer who had sneered and dismissed Curtis when he came to report his stolen benefits. Digging into Myers's background revealed a trail of gambling debts, suspicious wire transfers, and financial troubles that painted a picture of desperation and corruption. Surveillance footage showed Myers stepping away from his desk at the exact moment Curtis arrived at the precinct. Phone records linked him directly to calls made from the burner phone used to execute the scam. It was a web of betrayal spun by a man sworn to uphold the law. As the evidence mounted, the precinct's facade began to crumble. By 9:00 p.m., Jason Myers was being escorted out in handcuffs, his face pale under the glare of flashing cameras. No comment, he mumbled to the pressing reporters as he was led to the squad car. Curtis Rafford watched the unfolding drama from his apartment, surrounded by Maya Alpha from 2C and two young cadets who had refused to leave his side since the story broke. The weight of years pressed heavily, yet something lighter stirred within him. Justice was no longer a distant hope. It was taking shape in the daylight. Outside the precinct that had once ignored and mocked Curtis now faced the full glare of national scrutiny. Uniformed officers stood stiffly outside the building, not in routine but in tense anticipation of the fallout to come. The Atlanta police chief, called away from a budget meeting, paced a conference room filled with muted televisions, broadcasting breaking news. Headlines scrolled relentlessly. Decorated war hero scammed and dismissed. Federal agencies launch investigation into veteran scam ring. Atlanta officer arrested for corruption. Behind the headlines lay a hard truth. One man's fight for dignity had exposed a network of corruption and betrayal that demanded reckoning. Curtis, seated quietly with those who had become his steadfast supporters, allowed himself a small, rare smile. The battle was far from over, but the tide had turned. A man once invisible had become impossible to ignore. The air around Curtis Rafford's apartment buzzed with a new energy, a mixture of relief, respect, and quiet celebration. The man who had once been ignored, mocked, and robbed was now at the center of a movement that spanned from neighborhood streets to the highest corridors of power. After the arrest of Officer Jason Myers and the federal investigations unfolding, Curtis's world was shifting from shadows to light. Surrounded by familiar faces, Maya with her steady presence, Alpha from 2C, who brought meals and warmth, and the young cadets who refused to leave his side, Curtis felt a sense of community rekindled. The stories shared online had brought him back into the fold of those who honored his service, and now official recognition was on the horizon. The day had been marked by visits from local leaders and veterans organizations, each expressing apologies and pledging support. But the true highlight was yet to come, a formal ceremony planned to honor Curtis's decades of dedication and resilience. Curtis dressed carefully in his best slacks and navy coat, the familiar cap perched proudly on his head. As he stepped outside, a gentle autumn breeze carried the scent of falling leaves and distant wood smoke. The streets were lined with friends, neighbors, and supporters who had gathered to pay tribute. At the ceremony, the marble plaque was unveiled, a lasting tribute engraved with Curtis Rafford's name, rank, and deeds. Military officials, local dignitaries, and community members stood side by side, some saluting others, wiping away tears. The crowd was a mosaic of ages and backgrounds united in honoring a man who had once seemed invisible. A presidential military liaison stepped forward, presenting Curtis with a new medal, the Presidential Medal for Civil and Military Honor, not for battlefield valor, but for integrity, courage, in the unwavering spirit of a true American hero. Curtis accepted the medal with a slight nod, his eyes steady but humble. Turning to the rows of young cadets standing in formation, he raised his hand in a slow, deliberate salute. One by one, every cadet returned the gesture, crisp, sharp, and united. In that moment, the man who had been dismissed and forgotten became impossible to ignore. His fight was not for medals, but for moments like this, moments where respect is given freely, where dignity is restored, and where a community stands taller because one man refused to shrink. As Curtis lowered his hand, he whispered barely audible more to himself than anyone else. I didn't fight for medals. I fought for moments like this. The flags fluttered in the autumn breeze, and somewhere beyond the ceremony, a generation stood a little taller, carrying forward the legacy of a man who had never forgotten. The ceremony had drawn a crowd that stretched beyond the courthouse steps. Veterans in crisp uniforms, families, clutching flags, and neighbors who had watched Curtis Rafford's quiet dignity unfold over the years. The autumn sky hung heavy with clouds, yet the atmosphere was electric, charged with a collective reverence that transcended age and background. As the marble plaque was unveiled, a hush fell over the crowd. The engraving bore Curtis's name, rank, and a simple but profound tribute: Defender, Rescuer, Legend. The words seemed to carry the weight of decades, the battles fought, the lives saved, and the silent sacrifices made long after the guns had fallen silent. Military brass stood at attention, some saluting, others wiping away tears that glistened in the fading light. Young cadets, their faces solemn and bright, mirrored the salute, their crisp hands rising in unison, a generation inspired by a man who refused to be forgotten. Maya stood nearby, clutching the original VA letter, a symbol of the struggle that had sparked this moment. She smiled gently as the presidential military liaison pinned the Presidential Medal for Civil and Military Honor on Curtis's chest, a recognition not just for war, but for unwavering integrity and resilience. Curtis accepted the medal with a modest nod. The weight of the honor was not in the medal, but in what it represented: a nation's acknowledgement of a man's lifelong commitment to service and truth. Turning to the rows of cadets, Curtis raised his hand in a deliberate, slow salute. Each cadet returned it with crisp precision. In that shared gesture was a bridge between past and future sacrifice and hope, silence and recognition. As the flags fluttered in the gentle breeze, Curtis whispered more to himself than anyone else: I didn't fight for medals. I fought for moments like this. The crowd slowly dispersed, carrying with them a renewed sense of purpose and a solemn vow to remember, to honor, and to carry forward the legacy of those who served with courage and dignity. And somewhere beneath the wide American sky, a generation stood a little taller, their hearts lifted by the story of a man who had refused to fade away.